The lamp on the low table shook a little every time someone walked past in the corridor. It was late, close to midnight, but the barracks at Chiran airfield were still full of small sounds. Boots on wood, a cough, the muffled clink of metal from the maintenance sheds outside where mechanics were still working by lantern light. Beyond that, a faint rumble from the direction of the runway, where engines were being tested for the dawn. Haruto sat cross-legged on his thin futon, sleeves rolled up, pen resting above the blank half of a sheet of paper. He had already written the first lines 3 times and torn them up twice. Dear father, dear mother. He stared at the characters. His own handwriting looked strangely formal. The ink had bled a little into the fibers of the cheap paper. On the shelf above his head, folded with almost ceremonial care, was his flight helmet. Next to it lay a small cloth-wrapped bundle, spare socks, a scarf his sister had knitted for him the previous winter, a short volume of poems he had carried through training and never quite admitted to his bunkmates he liked to read. Under his futon, tucked into the rough tatami matting, lay the orders issued that afternoon. He knew the exact words without looking. Special attack mission. Takeoff 0540. Aircraft Type 0 carrier fighter. Armament 250 kg bombs. Objective enemy warship east of Okinawa. Pilot Flight Petty Officer 2nd Class Kato Haruto. He lifted the pen and forced his hand to move. Father, mother. By the time you read this letter, I will already be on the way to my eternal duties. He paused. The phrases were ones he had seen in other letters, the ones older pilots had left behind. They sounded like something written in a textbook, distant from the cramped little room, from the damp smell of his wool blanket. He wanted to write instead. I am afraid. I don't want to die. I wanted to sit for my university exams in Kyoto. I wanted to walk along the Kamo River in spring. I wanted to see what the world looked like when it wasn't covered in uniforms. He looked across the barracks. On the next futon, Saburo was snoring softly, arm thrown over his eyes. He was one of those people who could sleep anywhere, anytime, even tonight. A little farther down, Nakajima lay on his back staring at the ceiling, eyes open, as if he could see through the boards to the sky. 5 of them had been named for tomorrow's mission. The others pretended not to watch them. Haruto bent back over the page. Please be reassured that your son goes to the front lines with a joyful heart, determined to defend the homeland until his last breath. He wrote the words carefully, each stroke neat, as he had been taught in elementary school. Neatness was a form of respect, even for a lie. He hesitated, and the story of how he had come to be in this room rose in him, clear and uninvited. He saw again the narrow street of his hometown in Osaka Prefecture, sunlight on packed dirt, the sound of vendors calling out the day's specials. He smelled the steam from his mother's kitchen, the soy and miso and rice. He heard the voices of his primary school classmates singing in the morning assembly, "May our emperor live for 10,000 years." It had all seemed so natural then. In those days before the war began, his world had been very small. The walk to school along the river, the classroom with its rows of wooden desks, the flagpole in the yard. Every Monday they bowed their heads toward Tokyo, toward a palace they had never seen, and toward an emperor they would never meet. To a boy in a blue-black uniform with a stiff collar, the emperor was not a human being. He was a story, a symbol at the front of textbooks, a face on coins and in framed portraits hung high on the wall. At 7, Haruto had learned to trace the characters for loyalty and filial piety. At 10, he had memorized passages from the imperial rescript on education, reciting them until the words blurred into a kind of prayer. At 12, he had already heard older boys talk of the fighting in China, of heroic charges, of banners waving above conquered cities. There were photographs in the newspapers of Japanese soldiers marching, rifles on their shoulders, lines neat and straight. The radio brought news of victories, and at school, teachers spoke of Japan's sacred mission in Asia. The country did not feel like it was at war, not at first. Life went on. Rice bowls were full. The trains ran on time. The worst hardship in his childhood had been his father's long hours at the shipping company and the way his mother's fingers were always red and cracked in winter from washing, cooking, and helping in the fields. Then, when he was 13, the principal called the students into the yard on a cold December morning. The teachers stood in a line. One of them held a scrap of paper with the latest news from the capital. Today at dawn, he announced, trying and failing to keep his voice level, our brave Navy has launched a glorious attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. The boys shouted with something like joy. Bells rang in the nearby temple. A spontaneous cheer rose up. Banzai, banzai, long live the Emperor, long live Japan. Haruto had cheered with them, throat raw, because everyone did, because it was the only thing to do. At that age, war was still a distant stage where heroes did great things. Only later would he understand what had really begun that day. By the time he left middle school, the world had shrunk in material things and expanded in fear. Rice came mixed with barley, then with cheaper grains, then with things that weren't rice at all. Soap got scarce. His mother began cutting his little sister's old kimono into new clothes. Neighbors whispered about ration cards, about black market traders who could somehow find sugar, oil, cigarettes. At school, physical training increased, academic classes shrank, they marched with wooden rifles. They learned to crawl through mud. They practiced putting on gas masks that made them look like insects. Still, there had been hope that the war would end before it swallowed everything. In 1943, Haruto passed the exam for Kyoto Imperial University. He dreamed of walking through campus gates, of lectures and books, of a future with ink on his fingers instead of oil. He never attended a single class. He received his acceptance letter and a few weeks later another envelope. This one bore the seal of the Navy. There had been a national program, the officer at the school explained. The country needed pilots. Educated young men were being offered the chance to learn to fly and to serve as aviation officers. It was an honor, a shortcut to becoming not just a soldier but an elite warrior of the air. On the form they pushed across the table, there were 3 lines. Volunteer for Navy flight training. Volunteer for Army flight training. Do not volunteer. The last line might as well have been written in invisible ink. The head teacher, a man who had once talked to Haruto about poetry, now spoke in a different register. Our country faces a grave test, he said, eyes shining. It is our duty as educated men to stand at the forefront. Those who do not volunteer must have the courage to live with that decision. Haruto had gone home that day, the paper folded in his pocket, heavy as lead. His father read it at the low table, lips pressed tight. His mother knelt beside him, hands folded in her lap. No one will think less of you if you wish to continue your studies, his father said, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely sure. His mother said almost nothing. She watched her son in that quiet way she had when worrying about something she couldn't fix. That night, Haruto lay awake, listening to the soft breathing of his younger brother on the other side of the paper-thin wall. He thought of walking into the university courtyard in civilian clothes while others his age were in uniform. He thought of people's eyes on his back. He thought of the next visit to the shrine, of neighbors' whispers. By morning, he had filled in the line, I volunteer for Navy flight training. He had told himself the war might end before he finished training, that he might never see combat, that in any case he would be flying a wonderful machine rising above the earth, touching the sky. That was something he could almost be excited about. Now in the dim barracks at Chiran, pen hovering above paper, he thought about how a single decision had led him, step by step, to this point where there was no path back. He wrote a few more lines to his parents, cautious phrases that said nothing and meant everything. Then his mind drifted again. He remembered the first sight of the training base near Tsuchiura. The rows of planes, wings glinting in the sun, the instructors with their harsh voices and quick hands, the shouting, the running, the constant drills. They had cut his hair close on the first day. They had taken his name and given him a number. From dawn to dark, they remade his body and his mind for flying and for obedience. There was almost no fuel to spare for training by then. Where pre-war pilots had spent months learning, flying long, careful patterns, he and his generation were pushed through in a fraction of the time. The days began at 5, sometimes earlier. Muster in the yard, breath steaming in front of his face in winter, sweat soaking his thin shirt in summer. Calisthenics, running, pack drills. Then classes, navigation, meteorology, engines, aerial tactics, and always between the technical lessons the same words. Loyalty. Self-sacrifice. The beauty of death in service to the emperor. The instructors used real examples, pointing to names on the board. This man crashed his damaged plane into an enemy ship rather than be captured. He did not fear death. That is the true spirit of the warrior. The room would murmur. Some boys would look solemn, some excited. Others would stare at their notebooks, not sure how they felt. When they finally got into the cockpits, the world changed. His first solo flight had been on a cold morning. The sky was clear, the air sharp. His instructor had climbed out of the rear seat, slapped the side of the fuselage, and shouted, "Remember your speed on takeoff and land as I showed you. Don't disgrace yourself." The engine's roar made the world shake. The runway blurred beneath him. For a terrifying instant, he felt the plane skitter, then it lifted, wheels leaving the earth behind. The base shrank to toy buildings. The people on the ground became dots. The river turned into a silver thread. The boundary between sky and ground seemed arbitrary, a line someone had drawn. Fear receded, replaced by a kind of awed quiet. Up there, with the engine steady and the instruments humming, it was possible to forget the slogans and the banners and simply be a person in a machine, cutting through air. That feeling had kept him sane through months, when everything else seemed designed to strip away individuality. But as 1944 turned into 1945, the war came closer in ways that could not be ignored. Trains brought wounded men back from the front, men with missing arms, men with blank eyes, men who stared at planes taking off and landing and said nothing. Rumors circulated faster than official news. Stories about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, about carriers sunk or not sunk, about American planes that outnumbered anything Japan could put up. One evening in the mess hall, an officer had pinned a single sheet of paper to the wall and called everyone to look. It described, in careful but glowing terms, a new tactic. Special attack units, Tokubetsu Kojikatai, pilots who used their planes as human-guided bombs to crash into enemy ships, achieving remarkable results. Someone near Haruto had inhaled sharply. Another had laughed too loudly, then fallen quiet. At first, it had sounded like an extreme, almost theoretical act, something for fanatics or for those whose planes were already crippled, not a normal assignment. A few weeks later, at a different base and under a different commanding officer, it became something much more concrete. They were gathered in the yard again, rows of brown uniforms, the rising sun flag behind the podium snapping in the wind. The commander, a man in his 40s with tired eyes, cleared his throat. "The enemy is closing in on the homeland," he said. "Our ships are few, our planes are few, but our spirit is strong. The honorable way of the warrior is to fall like a cherry blossom in full bloom, giving his life at its peak for his lord and country. We are forming special attack units here. Volunteers will be given the chance to strike a decisive blow against the enemy fleet." He paused, sweeping his gaze along the line. Those who wish to volunteer step forward. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush bone. Haruto's heart pounded. His body stood very still, as if any movement would shatter the thin surface between him and something irreversible. No one had said anything about what would happen to those who did not step forward. The air seemed to thicken. He could feel the presence of the boys on either side of him, their uncertainty like heat. Somewhere down the line, a boot scuffed. A single man stepped forward, back straight. He was older, one of the more committed types, then two more. Haruto stared at the flag. He thought of his father wearing his old soldier's cap at the summer festival. He thought of his teacher's face when he signed the volunteer form for the Navy. He imagined staying still and hearing the rumors that would follow. Kato didn't volunteer. He imagined letters sent to his parents, questions. His foot moved almost of its own accord. He took the step. Later that night in the washroom, someone half-jokingly called those who had stepped forward brave men. Someone else said, not entirely under his breath, or fools. In his thin blanket, staring at the ceiling, Haruto wondered which one he was. He wondered if there was any real difference. Months later at Chiran, he had watched other special attack units take off day after day. The base itself, built on the edge of low hills, did not look like a place designed for death. In spring, plum and cherry trees around the nearby village bloomed. The air smelled of soil and tea bushes. Children could sometimes be heard laughing in the distance. Yet inside the perimeter, everything revolved around departures that had no return. On mornings when missions were scheduled, the routine shifted. The pilots assigned to fly would be called early. Others would stand back, watching as they walked to the briefing room, their footfalls strangely loud on the packed earth. There would be a shrine visit, a formal bow to the rising sun flag, a few solemn words from the commander. Then a different kind of busy silence settled over the base. Mechanics swarmed around each plane, checking fuel, tightening bolts, wiping the plexiglass canopies. The assigned pilots would sit a little apart in the mess hall, bowls of rice in front of them. The cooks tried to provide slightly better food. A spoonful of white rice instead of mixed grain, perhaps a small piece of pickled radish, or if there was anything left in the stores, a tiny square of fish. "Eat well," an older mechanic would say softly, not meeting their eyes. Some pilots joked loudly, holding their chopsticks like they were swords. Some hardly spoke at all. Haruto had watched them. He had watched Saburo pat the side of his plane as if it were a living animal. He had watched a quiet boy named Mori fold his farewell letter 3 times with almost ritualistic care, smoothing out each crease. The planes would line up on the runway. Engines would roar to life, sending a tremor through the ground and through the chests of those watching. The pilots would wave or not wave. They would disappear down the runway, wheels leaving the earth almost in slow motion, lifting into a sky that looked as if it could hold them forever. Then they were gone. Hours later, a rumor might come back with a radio report. A ship hit, smoke seen on the horizon, enemy anti-aircraft fire heavy. At night in the quiet, those same watchers would add names to a list on the wall, brushstrokes black and final. Haruto had lived in that rhythm long enough to think, foolishly, that it might last forever, that he might somehow slip through the cracks of fate. Now the paper under his hand made it clear that his day in the pattern had come. He finished his letter to his parents with a practiced flourish and started another to his younger brother. "Study hard," he wrote. "Be kind to mother. Do not let anyone say our family produced cowards." He did not know how to tell a 14-year-old boy not to make the same choices he had made. He was not sure if he believed that they had really been his choices. By the time he laid the pen down, his hand ached. The lamp had burned low, its glow yellow and tired. One by one, the others in the barracks either gave in to sleep or lay still, pretending. Saburo rolled over and muttered something unintelligible. Nakajima swung his feet to the floor, padded quietly to the end of the room, and stood for a long time at the small, clouded window. Unable to lie still any longer, Haruto pulled on his tunic and stepped outside. The night air was cold, damp with the promise of early spring. The sky above the airfield was hazy, starlight blurred around the edges of clouds. From the direction of the maintenance sheds came the faint clanging of tools. Someone was laughing soft and low, but the sound died quickly, as if they remembered what day it was. He walked slowly toward the line of trees that marked the edge of the base. Beyond them, he could see the faint outline of farmhouses, the suggestion of neat fields. Somewhere a dog barked twice and then was silent. He thought of walking all the way out, not stopping, of going home on foot, of knocking on his parents' door in the middle of the night and collapsing on the threshold. The image lasted 3 steps. There were guards at the gate. There were neighbors who would talk. There was the unshakable knowledge that even if he did manage to run, the war and what it had done to his country would follow him. He turned back. Inside, he lay down on his futon without undressing. The wool of his uniform itched. His mind replayed the coming hours like a silent film. Reveille, briefing, shrine, photographs, the walk to the runway, the mechanic's last words, the feel of the control stick, the sound of the engine. He tried to imagine the moment when he would see the enemy ship, how big it would look through the sight, whether he would still be able to steer straight. Beneath all of that, beneath the formal thoughts about duty and honor, there was a simpler, more stubborn wish to see another summer, to sit at his parents' table and complain about the heat, to pick up a book without feeling guilty. He eventually drifted into a shallow, exhausted half-sleep, where dreams and waking fears tangled into one. The bell at the end of the corridor dragged him out of it while the sky outside was still black. He sat up too fast, the room spun. Saburo was already lacing his boots. Nakajima's face, in the pale light from the corridor, looked strangely calm. They dressed without speaking. The motions were automatic: shirt, trousers, flight jacket, boots, laces double-knotted. They folded their futons and put them away neatly as regulations demanded. No one commented on how pointless that seemed. Outside, the air bit at his cheeks. His breath clouded before him. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed, confused by the lights and the early stir. They assembled in the briefing room, a low building with maps pinned to its walls. The commander stood by a table, hands behind his back. His face was drawn, stubble shadowed his chin. He did not look like someone sending others to death so much as someone being eaten slowly by the knowledge of what he was ordering. He went over the plan again. The route over the sea, the rendezvous point with the small fighter escort that would try probably unsuccessfully to protect them from enemy interceptors, the likely position of the American ships based on the previous day's reconnaissance. Haruto tried to listen, to fix every instruction in his mind, but part of him was drifting already, as if his soul had stepped a little to the side of his body. When the tactical details were done, the commander's voice changed. "You are the shield of the homeland," he said. "Thanks to your sacrifice, our mothers and sisters can sleep safely. The eyes of the nation are upon you. Do not fear death. Embrace it as a warrior. Die in such a way that you will make your ancestors proud." He bowed to them, the pilots bowed in return, a short, precise motion. From there, they walked as a group to the small shrine at the edge of the base. The path took them past the edge of the fields. The sky was beginning to lighten, a thin streak of gray-blue lay along the horizon in the east. At the shrine, they rinsed their hands in the cold water, the shock of it clearing Haruto's head for a moment. They passed under the wooden gate and stood before the simple altar. The priest, an old man with a face like dry paper, murmured prayers, waving a branch of sacred sakaki leaves. The words flowed over Haruto like a language he had once known and half forgotten. He bowed his head and formed a silent prayer of his own, the only honest one he could manage. "Let my parents live. Let my brother grow old. Let my sister find happiness. Let this all end." If there was an answer, it was the same one his country had been getting for months now: silence. Back at the airfield, a photographer waited near a makeshift backdrop. One by one, they were positioned on a stool, flight caps adjusted, collars straightened. The photographer's fingers trembled slightly on the shutter. "Look straight," he said. "Think of your families." The flash popped, the shutter clicked. A small moment was captured. The set of Haruto's jaw, the way his eyes seemed older than his 19 years, the hint of bags under them from a night without true sleep. That photograph would be developed later, mounted on a wooden plaque, maybe placed on a family altar if it ever found its way to his parents' house. For now, it was just one more thing to endure. In the mess hall, a last meal was laid out. Bowls of white rice steamed on the tables. There was miso soup, thin but warm. A small piece of pickled plum sat on each bowl like a dot of color. Someone had found a bottle of sake. Small cups were poured and passed along the bench. Haruto picked up his chopsticks and found that his hands were steady. The rice tasted like something from another life. He chewed slowly, forcing himself to swallow. Saburo next to him laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't very funny. Nakajima sat in silence, eyes lowered, fingers cradling his cup of sake as if it were something fragile. "Eat, eat," one of the cooks urged, wiping his hands on his apron. "You must not go hungry." It wasn't about hunger, but no one said that. When the bowls were empty, when the pilots had drunk the small, burning mouthfuls of sake, they walked out into the growing light. Along the path to the runway, a group of local girls stood in simple uniforms, their hair tied back with plain cloth ribbons. They held small flags and bunches of flowers, faces pale in the dawn. They had been here many mornings before. They had seen many boys go. One girl, perhaps 16, stepped forward as Haruto approached. Without looking quite at his face, she held out a small branch of cherry blossoms. Her hands shook. He bowed and took it, murmuring a thank you. The blossoms were cool against his palm, delicate and almost absurdly beautiful. He tucked them carefully into the front of his flight suit, above his heart. The planes waited on the tarmac, lined up like silent animals. Haruto's aircraft was older, a Zero that had flown more hours than most. The paint was scuffed. The canopy glass had tiny scratches at the edges. Under its fuselage, bolted awkwardly but securely, hung a single 250-kilogram bomb. The mechanic assigned to his plane, Tanaka, a man in his 30s with oil permanently embedded in the lines of his hands, stood by the wing, rag over his shoulder. "We did everything we could," Tanaka said quietly, eyes on the ground. "The engine is sound, she'll carry you all the way after that." He didn't finish the sentence. Haruto bowed to him a little deeper this time. "Thank you for taking care of her," he said. "I leave the ground to you." It was one of those little phrases they used. You have the ground, I have the sky. They said it to avoid saying the more obvious goodbye. Climbing the small ladder to the cockpit felt both like something he had done 100 times and something entirely new. He slid into the seat, the worn cushion compressing under him. The straps of the harness felt stiff as he pulled them across his chest and buckled them. He placed his hands on the control stick, then on the throttle, then back again, needing the familiarity of touch. The cherry blossoms pressed lightly against his chest when he leaned forward. Around him, mechanics moved with practiced efficiency, pulling chocks from wheels, signaling readiness to the control crew. Another pilot's engine coughed, then roared to life, spinning the propeller into a blur. Haruto's engine started on the second try, the vibration running up through his bones. The cockpit filled with the smell of fuel and oil. The noise closed off the outside world, turned everything beyond the glass into a silent film. He moved the control surfaces as instructed, rudder left, rudder right, ailerons up and down. The plane answered. Ahead, the runway stretched out, a strip of earth leading toward the low hills and the sky beyond. He looked once at the small cluster of officers and base personnel standing to the side. Some were saluting. Some had their arms folded tightly, hats pulled low. He brought his hand up to his helmet in a crisp salute of his own. Then he eased the throttle open. The plane lurched, rolled, gathered speed. The vibrations intensified. The world narrowed to the trembling view over the nose, the white center line of the runway flicking past. At a speed he could judge now by feel as much as by the gauge, he pulled back gently on the stick. The nose lifted, the pounding feel of the wheels against the ground ceased. The airfield fell away. For a few seconds, as Chiran shrank behind him and the distant mountains came into view, there was an eerie sense of normalcy. This was flying, something he knew how to do, something he had done on practice flights with no bomb, with the expectation of return. He circled to form up with the other planes assigned to his unit. Through the canopy glass, he could see Saburo's profile in the left-hand plane, jaw set. Nakajima's aircraft held steady on the right. They turned south toward the sea. The land receded beneath them, green fields giving way to gray-blue water. The coast curved away like a line drawn on a map. The drone of the engines settled into a monotonous hum. Haruto looked at his instruments, altitude, airspeed, fuel. He checked his heading, adjusted slightly to correct for wind drift. Training and muscle memory carried him along. Below, early morning fishing boats scattered at their approach, their white wakes fanning out like lines on a chalkboard. The sea in the first light looked almost gentle, its surface broken only by the ripples of the wind. He tried not to think about the men on the ships he was expected to attack. During lectures, enemy sailors had been described as faceless shapes, part of machines that had to be broken. In the air, with the distance beginning to compress, that simplification felt harder to maintain. He imagined briefly someone not so different from himself, a boy on a ship's deck looking up at the dots in the sky and feeling a lurch of fear and anger. He pushed the thought aside. There wasn't room for it now. The radio crackled occasionally, short coded words passing between their formation leader and the escort fighters. The voices sounded small, directionless, as if coming from another world. Minutes stretched. There was no sense of speed up there, only of movement through an endless empty space. The sun climbed slowly, painting a brighter path on the water ahead. Haruto's thoughts slipped in and out of focus. At times, he was entirely absorbed in the details of flying, the feel of the controls, the minor corrections to stay in formation. At other moments, his mind wandered to images with the vividness of dreams. He saw his mother kneeling at the family altar, lighting incense in front of the small wooden shrine. He saw his father sitting on the veranda, smoking a cigarette, looking out at the paddy fields without seeing them. He saw his younger brother hunched over a textbook, lips moving as he memorized something dull and necessary. He thought of the university library he had never entered, the shelves of books, the quiet echoing corridors. He wondered strangely what the world would look like in 20 years. Would there still be uniforms and flags, or would people simply be going about their lives, thinking less about nations and more about their families, their work, the weather? He realized with a small jolt that he would never know. The lead pilot's voice came over the radio terse. Target area ahead, prepare to descend. Haruto looked up. On the horizon, small shapes had appeared against the line of sea and sky. At first they were almost invisible, just tiny irregularities in the smooth curve of the Earth. Then, as seconds passed, they resolved into dots with masts and superstructures, ships. More than he had expected, destroyers, cruisers, maybe a carrier farther back, it was hard to tell at this distance. A wave of something like cold washed through him. This was no longer theory, no longer a map on a table or a diagram drawn on a chalkboard. This was what all the training, the lectures, the sleepless nights had been leading toward. The American fleet. Puffs of white appeared in the sky above the ships, anti-aircraft shells bursting. They were too distant to hear, but he knew the sound that would soon accompany them, the harsh, cracking thunder and the rattle of shrapnel on aluminum skin. He felt his heart beating hard against the harness. He had been taught what to do. Hold altitude until within range. Descend in a shallow dive to minimize time in the densest flak. Pick a target, commit, do not waver. Aim not for the deck but for the most vulnerable point, near the bridge or the funnels, depending on the ship. He knew all that. He had repeated it in classrooms, in practice sessions, in his head as he tried to fall asleep. Knowing and doing were different things. The formation began to break, each pilot peeling off slightly to choose his line of approach. The escort fighters climbed, ready to engage whatever enemy planes might rise to meet them. Haruto's hands were wet on the control stick. He wiped them quickly on his flight suit, then tightened his grip. He chose a ship in the middle of the group, slightly larger than the others, smoke trailing from its funnels. Perhaps a cruiser, maybe something else. Labels didn't matter now. He nudged the nose of the plane down, feeling the shift in his stomach as altitude bled away. The sea rose in his field of vision. The ship's once small specks swelled with unsettling speed. Black bursts appeared closer now, not just above but around them. The plane shuddered as a shockwave passed by. He heard faintly through the engine noise and his helmet the crack of flak. Fear tried to climb up his throat, to turn his hands, to make him pull away, to find some path that did not end in that single point of collision. He held on to the one thing he had left control of, the straightness of his line. He remembered the cherry blossoms pressed against his chest. He remembered his mother's face as he had last seen her, eyes shining with unshed tears she had pretended were not there. He remembered, surprisingly, a poem he had once copied out in school about a lone bird flying into the evening sky. His world narrowed to the nose of his plane and the growing shape of the ship. The details of the last seconds, the exact angle, the sound, the light belonged to him alone and then not even to him. Back in Japan, days and months later, a telegram would arrive at a small house in Osaka Prefecture. It would be written in formal language, informing Mr. and Mrs. Kato that their eldest son, Flight Petty Officer 2nd Class Kato Haruto, had fallen gloriously in battle as a member of a special attack unit. It would describe his death as splendid, as brave, as typical of the Japanese spirit. It would arrive on a day when his mother had been wondering whether to plant more sweet potatoes in the field or whether the war would end before harvest. She would take the telegram in hands that had kneaded dough and washed clothes and wiped children's faces. She would bow her head as she read the stiff, respectful characters. She would sit down slowly on the wooden floor, the paper crinkling in her grip. His father would read the words twice, 3 times, as if repetition could change their meaning. He would nod in the silent way men did when told something that tore them apart. They would place the telegram in front of the household altar, lighting incense, arranging a small dish of rice and a cup of tea. Weeks later, perhaps, a framed photograph would arrive from the base. Haruto in his flight suit, eyes serious, mouth set. The edges of the frame would smell faintly of lacquer. They would put it on the altar beside his grandparents' memorial tablets. Visitors would come and bow. Some would say words like honor and sacrifice. Some would say nothing at all, their silence as heavy as the humid summer air. At Chiran, long after the war, people would build a museum. They would line its walls with the photographs of young men like Haruto. Beneath each picture, a name, a rank, a place of origin, and dates that ended in 1944 or 1945. In glass cases, they would lay out letters written in careful, schoolboy script, farewell notes that mingled patriotism and filial piety, and in the spaces between the lines, unspoken fear. Visitors would walk slowly past them, reading words that had once been written by lamplight in cramped barracks. I go now gladly to protect the homelands. Please take care of mother after I am gone. I regret only that I cannot do more. Some letters would have been censored, phrases blacked out where a hint of doubt had crept in. On spring days outside the museum, the cherry trees would bloom. Their petals would fall in soft drifts onto the paths, onto the stone monuments engraved with the names of the dead. Children would run between the trees, laughing, their voices bright in a way the young men in the photographs had not been allowed to be in their last months. Old men, some with faded tattoos from their Navy days, some with nothing to show on the outside of what they had seen, would sit on benches and gaze up at the branches. They would remember the roar of engines at dawn, the smell of aviation gasoline, the feel of paper between their fingers as they added another name to the list. They would not always know what to tell the children who asked them about the war. In classrooms decades after the surrender, students would open history textbooks that mentioned the kamikaze in a paragraph or two. They would read about special attack units, about desperate measures, about fanatical pilots. Some of them would visit Chiran on school trips. They would stand awkwardly in groups, guided by teachers who themselves had been taught a version of events filtered through layers of guilt, pride, regret, and forgetting. They would look at the photographs on the wall and be struck by a strange recognition. The faces looking back at them were not so different from their own or from their older siblings. Bad haircuts, uneven ears, an eye that crinkled a little when someone laughed. They would read the ages, 18, 19, 20. They would realize, perhaps for the first time, that kamikaze had not been a kind of wind or a myth or a single idea, but thousands of individuals whose lives had been shortened to a point. On the other side of the world, in small American towns, old sailors who had served on ships off Okinawa would sit in faded armchairs and tell grandchildren carefully edited stories. They would talk about the sudden screaming of alarms, the way the sky had filled with planes, some diving straight at them, some shot to pieces before they got close. They might mention the fear, the anger, the drill of rushing to battle stations, the spray of water from near misses, the sickening jar when a plane hit metal and fire blossomed along the deck. Some of them would say with a kind of grim respect, they weren't cowards, those pilots. Crazy maybe, brave too, I was glad when they missed, but I never forgot the look of them coming in. They would rarely talk in detail about what it meant to see a human being turn themselves into a weapon. The war would recede further into the past. The people who had lived through it would grow fewer. The ideas that had driven young men like Haruto into the air on one-way missions would be studied in universities, debated in books, turned into documentaries with somber music. But on quiet nights, in houses far from any battlefield, someone might still find themselves imagining, without quite knowing why, a young man in a barracks room, bent over paper, trying to find the right words to say goodbye without saying that he was terrified. They might picture the walkway to a runway lit by early morning gray, the small weight of a cherry blossom in a breast pocket, the vibration of an engine under gloved hands. They might notice, without fanfare, that the world they lived in now, imperfect and noisy and often unjust, was nonetheless a place where they could close their eyes in bed and expect to wake up in the morning, without anyone having asked them to trade their life for an abstract idea. In some quiet part of their mind, they might feel gratitude for that, and a thin thread of connection to those whose lives had ended before they had a chance to feel the same. The lamp in the barracks at Chiran had long since burned out. The wooden building itself no longer stood. The runway was cracked and overgrown in places. The war was over. The empire whose songs had filled schoolyards was gone. But the story of a boy who once signed a sheet of paper in a classroom, who learned to love the feeling of a plane leaving the ground, who found himself writing neat, formal lies to his parents on the last night of his life, remained. When the wind moved through the cherry trees at Chiran in spring, it sounded, if one listened closely, like pages turning, like the quiet murmur of voices speaking from a long time ago, not asking for anything, only reminding whoever happened to hear that each life that ended in those years had been as real and as full of possibilities as any life now. And then even that sound would fade, leaving only the rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of children, and the ordinary steady breathing of a world finally at peace, at least for the moment.